I know you can't see my face, that's okay, I got a mask on anyway. This is Dave Kites from the Oto Wood Shop, making a video here to show you our new narrow ripping jig called Jig Set A. And by narrow I mean about 2.5 inches or less of the ripped piece. When you bring the fence over to try and make a narrow strip in between the fence and the blade, you run into the guard, and rather than remove the guard, which is what's commonly done now, you take throat plate out, take this out, put the short riving knife in, and then you can bring the fence all the way over to the blade. You can actually run the fence into the blade if you work at it. So we don't want to do that. We'd like to do it, cut all our materials with the guard in place because it protects us from bumping the blade and it does a dust pickup. So if it's under 2.5 inches, I would suggest strongly that you use the jig. This will avoid damaging the guard by pushing it. If you have it really close here and you're down here trying to push it, and you push it over like this, you push this into the blade, you see it's been done, push that into the blade and you damage it, and eventually it'll get damaged enough, we'll have to replace it. It also, if you get really thin, when you take this out, and then you've got the short riving knife in, you can get over really close, and then when you push it through, whatever you're using to push it through gets sawed. This has been sawed here, it's been sawed there. It's not going to last very long if we keep doing that. So we don't want to do that. We don't want to push the fence into the blade accidentally. We don't want to bump the blade accidentally, because when you take this away, you have no guard. Now you're working right here. If you reach for a cut-off piece here and you bump the blade, as has been done already in the shop, you will trip the brake and it will require you to compensate the shop for the cost of the cartridge, and if you damage the blade, for the blade too. So we want to avoid all those difficulties by using this jig. And the jig will avoid all those difficulties, and it only takes a very short time to set up. I'm going to demonstrate that for you. Now, when you get down to really narrow strips, meaning 1/4 inch or less of a cut strip, you know, left to right dimension as it's on the saw, 1/4 inch or less, there's some extra things you have to do. I call those thin strips. Thin strips is another video. It shows you some other steps to take to cut them easily with the guard in place, uniform strips, no damage to anything, no risk to you or any of the machinery or parts or your expensive exotic wood if you're cutting, whatever it is, no risk to anything. Just takes a few seconds. So if you're going to cut really thin, please look at the video. It allows you to cut them inside, not outside, and by cutting inside, you cut them over and over and over again without moving the fence. When you get really thin and you try to use that other device that has the little wheel on it and you try to cut them on the outside, you got to keep nudging the fence every time. It's a real chore. And you don't always get it exactly the same. Sometimes you have a little more pressure, a little less pressure, and that can make the width of the strip vary. So if you use the jig, you can cut it on the inside with all the protections and advantages of the guard and the dust pickup. And that's why we have the jig. Now I'm going to demonstrate the narrow rip jig set A. I labeled it A. There's 2 parts to it. I'm going to demonstrate it by cutting a 3/4 inch wide ripped strip here. And I'm going to start with this. You notice it ain't straight. One of the advantages to this jig is that I can straighten this without a lot of trouble using the jig. I'll show you how to do that. and then we'll cut our strip. And when I get it straight, I don't know if I'll get my whole 3/4 out of this or not. I just kind of butchered it up on the bandsaw, but maybe I won't get my whole 3/4, but we'll see what we can get out of it. Okay, but first we're going to set the jig up, and then we're going to straighten this without much difficulty, you'll see, and then we'll try to rip the 3/4 strip or whatever we can get out of it. All right, if you're cutting above 1/4 of an inch wide, the gap here is not going to bother you. The gap in the throat plate between the edge of the gap and the blade, or the edge of the gap and the riving knife over here, is narrow enough that a 3/4 piece, there's no way it's going to fall down in there. If you're cutting below 1/4 of an inch, it's going to have a tendency to catch in there, especially if it's down under 1/8 of an inch. That's why there's another video. That's one of the things that shows you how to avoid in the other video for the thin strip cutting jig. It's the same jig, but you got to do a couple extra things. So look at that if you're going to cut under 1/4 of an inch. But we're not, so we're going to leave the stroke plate in. We're going to get our height adjusted about right here. We're going to check whether or not we're engaging these pawls, this pawl and the one just like it on the other side, or this pawl, which you can use or not use, intended to keep it from kicking back. If you elevate the blade enough, this one will stop engaging the wood. If I lower this down a little bit more, now it's engaged, and now the wood can't come back. I have to go forward with it. Goes forward, won't come back. Okay. I'm going to leave it engaged, but I need to be a little higher here. We need to clear the wood a little more, about like that. And when I do that, just barely catching there. So that's not so important in a fairly wide cut that we're going to rip. But under 1/4, that becomes important. Something else we talked about in the thin strip jig. So we have our height set satisfactorily. Let's put the jig up now. The first part is this big support fence, all the support fence. You put it on here with a couple of fence clamps. You get this edge up against the saw. That positions it properly. You put the 2 clamps on, and the support fence is now in place. The support fence has a groove here that the jig itself is going to ride in. The other part of the setup is going to ride in there, and a stop, and a support plate. Let's see how that all comes into play when we put on the other part of the jig. This is an aluminum track that rides in this slot. When we put that here, when you do that, then this edge of the movable part comes right along the fence edge. Got another stop, so when we push this all the way through, these stops will hit each other, and we'll know we're at the end of our stroke. And we're going to set things up so that when that happens, we know we're done, and our ripped piece is free and clear of the blade. This is going to hold our sacrifice block, and this is adjustable so you can have different width sacrifice block, okay? And we're using a sacrifice block because when we rip our strip, when we come along here, we want to end up with the end of our strip, the end of our stock, somewhere up here on the riving nut. We don't want to stop just after it gets cut through. It'll be cut through right about there, still contacting the blade a little bit. Not real important in a thick strip like this, but in a thin strip it's very important. So we talk about that more in the thin strip video too. But it's good practice to just get your cut and your stock clear of the blade before you stop pushing through. In order to accomplish that, what what we're going to do is use a sacrifice push piece in here. So we need a piece that will go in here, and when we end up, our stroke is done by this matching. Now our stroke is done. We still want to be not cutting. Well, I'll leave this loose so I can take it away and show you. We're going to end up in this situation. The stock is here. The sacrifice piece is here. The stock is well clear of the blade. The sacrifice piece is only cut up to there. There's no way you're going to get this blade into this because I built these stops so it won't ever happen. So when you stop here, when these meet, if you got your right distance here in your sacrifice block, your stock will be through, the sacrifice block will be cut to here, and you'll be done. Then you can turn off the saw and retrieve all your stuff. Okay, so that's the idea. Now, we said that's crooked. Can't cut uniform straight strips out of a crooked piece like that. So normally, to straighten this, if you just use the fence, you're going to have difficulty, as you know, because you can't get the whole length along the fence at once. And so you start out with this part along the fence, and as you move it, the piece is going back and forth as it tries to go along the blade. It's going to bind, it's not going to cut straight, it's going to be a mess. Well, we all know that, so we don't do that. So the only way to do that with just the fence being used is to tack a piece of plywood on here, a thin piece, 1/4 inch thick or something, that sticks over the edge here and is nice and straight, and you tack it to this, and then you run the plywood along the fence and make your straight cut down on this side. Well, with our jig, we don't need to do that because the jig is long enough so that I can put my sacrifice block in there and I can still have my piece contacting the jig all the way along its length. Well, it doesn't contact all the way along, but you know what I mean. The whole thing is on this straight line now. So it's not going to be wandering back and forth as it goes along. It's going to sit right still as this sacrifice block just pushes it through. So I'm going to put this here and I'm going to tighten up my sacrifice block holder. What I did there, I know you can't see it, so I'll move it up. See, I put the block in here and I pushed this up against it and I tightened these two down pretty good, and now it's held. Okay? I don't have to worry about him anymore. He's going to follow the jig. So I put my piece in here now. This sacrifice block is long, and when I get done, I'm going to have my stock actually completely clear of the riving neck. So my stock and my grip part must be completely clear when I get done with this long one. I can afford the long one because with this length of stock, it's still all on the fence. So now I just slide the fence back and forth until I get where I think I'm going to get a cut that will take all this curvature out all the way down. Now, coming up here, there's the thin part right there. I got to get over a little more. I'm not going to get it all. I really made this crooked. So I'm going to cut it right about, I'm going to try it right there. I'll put this down. If you weren't sure where to do it, and I'm not, you could do 2 or 3 cuts. Just work your way up to it. You're going to lose some stock when you straighten a piece. There's no avoiding it. Got to cut some off to straighten it. We're going to want to hold the stock against the jig, just like it was a fence, because it is like a fence. And we don't have to worry about our sacrifice piece though, because he's going to get held by that apparatus on the end of the jig. So there we are. We've got the right length sacrifice piece. We got our stock up against the fence totally. We got the right height here, and we're clear of the blade. See, the support plate extends back, and the jig is still completely on this support plate. There's no tendency for it to fall off the saw, which it used to do if you had like a taper jig. You know, you ever try to use a taper jig? Well, it's hanging off the back end and it's tipping and it's wobbling. No good. So, you can use this with a taper jig too, just the fence. All right, so here we go. I'm going to try to cut one side. So I cut off a bunch of crookedness. My sacrifice piece pushed my stock all the way through. You see my ripped piece? I did cut it clear. It's cut all the way straight. And it was totally clear of the blade here. The sacrifice piece isn't, but he's there. But I can just pull him back. If I tighten this up just a little more, by pushing on it a little harder, it should hold it. Thinking about putting sandpaper on this edge here to hold that when you press it in. I might do that. Okay, so then you pull it back and you're ready for the other cut. So to straighten this piece, now we got one straight side, now we just got to straighten the other side. And we'll flip it over and we'll see this is going to miss. So I need to take a little, this is the narrow part. I'm looking here, need another. I'm not going to get a 3/4 piece out of this when I get done. Yeah, maybe just about. Anyway, we're going to put that on there. Same sacrifice piece, don't have to change it. Clear the blade. Throw this away. Turn on the phone. Okay, we had a little trouble that time because our cutoff piece was not continuous. So when it got loose, it dropped down and caught there. So I had to use this, pry it up a little bit, okay? That happens when you have a piece that's not continuous. A way to avoid that, if you're going to be doing this and you think that might happen, is to put the zero clearance throat plate in here. There's no reason not to do that anytime, actually, as long as you're making straight up and down vertical cuts. You can use it. I'll show it to you. It's this guy. And he will fit right in there where the red thing is. So maybe it's a good idea to show you that. You take this back and push this out of the way. Of course, now we have a piece that is straight on both sides. So we're not going to have any more trouble with things falling in the crack unless our stock that's left on this side gets so thin that it falls in the crack. Because our strip over here is going to be 3/4, and we know that's not going to fall in the crack. But the stock could fall in the crack on the other side. So if we put this in here, now hardly any crack. Not going to fall in there. There's a couple of these on the rack over there where the jig is stored. So you can use it. All right. Wiggling around a little because I don't have the fence locked down. That's okay. Now, if we want to cut a 3/4, we bring this over. We cut the 3/4 between here. This, the way the jig is built, obviously, it's low, so it comes underneath all this stuff on the other side, and whether it comes below the pawl or not, it's not really important. It does happen to just come below the pawl. This is 10 inches wide, so if you don't have to have it super precise, you can use the fence rule to measure your strip, your piece, your ripped piece. Just add 10 inches to what you want here, that's 10 1/4 or 10 3/4, and set the fence at 10 3/4. We want a 3/4 inch piece, and this is 10 inches, so it's 10 3/4 between the fence and here. That's what it tells you. There you go. Let's see. Oh, look, we're going to just get it. All right. Now down here we're going to have complications, but it's okay. So we bring that back. Now we got the height set. We got 10 3/4 inch set on there. So we know we're going to get a 3/4 strip, very close. We're going to start behind the blade. Always check and make sure you're not into the blade, so when you turn it on, okay. So you make sure you got the sacrifice piece. We're going to use them again. Still good. And we're ready to go. So it was a good thing to put the zero clearance plate in because our stock cut off. This is actually off the outside. This would have been normally the bigger piece of stock. But when we get down to the end of your stock, if you're ripping up something completely into all little pieces, then you're going to end up maybe with something like that. So the zero clearance throat plate keeps this from going in there. And there you go. So, now, take this back, we got 3/4 wide, cut, strip, nice and straight, no problems. Had all the dust pickup working for us, never in danger of touching the blade. It's all just hunky-dory. Okay, we cut that 3/4 nicely. Now I'm going to cut something just a little narrower. But before I do that, I want to make some comments here about looking at what you're doing. A lot of guys I've noticed want to keep this up even when they leave this in there and they're ripping something with the fence fairly close. They keep that up. Mostly it's because they realize if the fence is really close and they try to push their stock through with something like this or one of the push sticks, that they're liable to do this and push this over into here, into the blade, as I showed you before. The other reason I think some of it is they think that they can do better if they can see that it's cutting okay. And we really can't. You're going to wiggle. If you try to make an adjustment, you're going to wiggle it, and you're probably going to end up pushing your stock into the side of the blade, which will chew up the edge, the side of it. Or you're going to slip and you're going to put this into the blade, and it's going to come back at you, and it's going to cut it no matter what. So you're going to have trouble doing all that. You really don't want to bother doing that. You can't really help anything anyway. So put this down. When you use this jig, you saw it works just fine, and you're going to see it work just fine on even thinner strips. So don't try to, don't leave this up. You lose the dust pickup, and you have the possibility of bumping the blade. So let's move this over now and cut a couple 1/4 inch strips just for fun. Remember, under 1/4, I want you to look at that other video called Thin Strip jig and see a few extra things you need to do to make a good successful cut of really thin strips under a quarter. So, but I've got it set now down at 10 1/4 on here, which is a 1/4 inch cut strip. I'm going to use a piece of stock here. Move this back, put my stock in place. Be sure I'm behind the blade. Thread down. Using the same push piece. This particle board is stiff enough that it's not breaking up on me. If you use real wood for these, scrap wood, but real wood, it doesn't break nearly as easily. It does a much better job. So, pretty much cut it all up. I got all of those in this little leftover piece. I got 4 nice ones, and no problem with that. And of course this guy is now, he's been cut up. So you wouldn't use him again for a new project. You'd get another piece of scrap wood from somewhere and use him. You could, if you had just thin strips to cut and your stock wasn't too wide, and this would push it adequately, then you could use this. You notice down here where it's not cut, you still got the material solid, so you can push it over there and it'll hold it. Okay, so that's the way that goes. Okay, now one last thing. Suppose you got a real long piece. It won't fit on the jig. It's too big to go from here to here with the sacrifice piece in there. Well, we can still do the job easily. We're going to take this part away. Put him back in the rack. And we're going to move just the fence over to our thin position. Let's say we want to cut 3/8 of an inch strips off of this piece, okay? 3/8 of this piece. Now, it's not 10 inches wide anymore, the jig, is it? No, we took away 6 inches. I built it so that part's 6 inches, this part's 4 inches. So now we just do 4 3/8, which is right there. Lock the fence. Okay, I got 3/8 of an inch gap here now. Set it 4 3/8. Now We're still going to use a sacrifice push block at the end. But picture this piece being really long, okay? What we're going to do is we're going to put this down. We're going to make sure we got it high enough, yep. We're going to put this down, and we're going to start this and push it by hand. Just push it by hand here, holding it against the fence with this. Now you remember, when you're doing the holding against the fence, you don't do it up here where the blade is. You do it down here behind, in front of, I guess you'd say, the blade. Because you don't want to push your cut piece. If you did it up here and it's cut, you're pushing this stock into the side of the blade. And you're not even doing any good holding the strip against the fence. You're just pushing the stock into the side of the blade. That's not what you want to do. So you do it back just behind the blade. So you'll see me start with it here, come up here, and then I'll hold, when I just kind of gauge by this curve here, and when I get up just beyond the curve of here, I know I'm about right, but I'm still not into the blade, so I'm okay to press there. So we put this down, and we just start feeding this long strip. And when we get it fed through, when we get to someplace like here, we stop, and you can keep holding this against the here, okay? And then we pick up our, and we just do it by hand. And we put that there, and then we push this through, and we push this through until, by hand, until we get to where we're not comfortable with our hand here. We don't want to go up under the guard. I don't want to get any chance of touching that blade. So when I get to about here, I'll quit. And then look what happened. I'm okay because I have pushed my stock past the blade. So you want to check that before you start. Now, like I said before, we're up to about 1.5 inches, 1 3/4 inches. A 10.5 or 11-inch piece is long enough to get you onto the riving knife here, okay? 14.5 will always get you all the way past the riving knife. So if you want to do it easy and not have to fret about, am I doing it good or not, just get a 14.5-inch piece of scrap for your push block, and you'll always be good. So I'll show you. It's pretty obvious, but let's just see. Long strip. It's going and going and going. Finally you get to the end. Notice I always turn the saw off, almost always. When I'm repeating strips, I don't always turn it off. If I'm pushing past here in particular, I know there's no danger of pushing this into the blade or anything like that, so I don't always stop. But when I'm in this situation here and I don't have my jig holding this piece, I always turn the saw off, let it stop, and then I lift and I can retrieve that. There's my stop. Here's my strip. 3/8. Presto digital. Okay, so not magic, not complicated. You can do it again. And with the guard down, I'm not worried too much about my fingers because if I feel that guard, I stop. And I've still got margin. See, the blade's way back there, and there's all this wood in between besides. So we're quite safe. But I always stop the saw. And then here's the other strip. So now we got two 3/8" strips, and they're the same. And they're even all the way to the ends, both ends. It does a very nice job. The saw is a super saw, it really is. So that's that. Again, if you're doing it this way, don't get this into the blade. Always check before you start the saw and look at it and make sure that for some reason you haven't done this. Because if you do that and you start it up, this gets torn up. And that really affects the way the jig works. Not good. Same thing can happen with the other jig. When you slide it over, you can push it right into here if you're not careful. So always check for your right spacing before you start the saw. All right, well, thank you then. I hope you get something out of this and get to use the jig and it works good for you. If you got any questions, again, give me a call. My phone number's there. It will be on a piece of paper down there. And a couple other notes about how to do this, but really should watch a video before you use the jig the first time. All right, see you around the shop.